The quiet hum of the late-night shift was interrupted by frantic barking. Officer Miller glanced up from his desk, expecting a routine disturbance. But when the sound grew louder, desperate, almost pleading, he stood, instinctively reaching for his flashlight. The police station's glass doors slid open, and a stray dog burst in. Its ribs showed beneath patches of matted fur, and its paws were caked with mud. The animal darted between desks, whining and circling frantically, as if searching for someone who would listen. "Hey, get out of here!" an officer called, waving a hand to shoo it away. But the dog didn't flinch. Instead, it locked eyes with Miller. There was something in its gaze, something almost human. Miller took a step forward. That's when he noticed it. The dog's fur was streaked with dirt and blood. His stomach tightened. This wasn't just a hungry stray. This was a cry for help. The dog ran to him, tail low, ears flattened in desperation. Then, with surprising force, it bit the fabric of his pant leg and tugged. Miller didn't pull away. He looked at his partner, Rodriguez, who had also stopped to watch. "This dog's trying to tell us something," Miller said, his voice firm. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "You think?" The dog let out another sharp whine and turned toward the door, looking back expectantly. Miller's gut told him to follow. He grabbed his coat and nodded to Rodriguez. "Let's see where this leads." With that, the officers stepped into the night, trailing the desperate dog into the unknown. The cold night air wrapped around Officers Miller and Rodriguez as they followed the stray dog through the silent streets. It moved with urgency, sprinting ahead, but stopping every few moments to glance back, making sure they were still following. "This is insane," Rodriguez muttered, tightening his grip on his flashlight. "We're chasing a stray in the middle of the night." Miller didn't respond. His instincts told him something was wrong. The way the dog moved, the sheer desperation in its eyes, it wasn't random. It was leading them somewhere. The dog suddenly veered off the main road, darting into a dark alley. The officers exchanged uneasy glances before stepping in. The sound of their boots echoed against brick walls. Garbage cans lay tipped over, the faint scent of decay in the air. Then, just ahead, the dog bolted under a broken chain-link fence, disappearing into an abandoned construction site. Miller hesitated. "You sure about this?" Rodriguez asked, scanning the area with his flashlight. Before Miller could answer, the dog let out a heartbreaking whimper. It wasn't just calling for them, it was begging. That was all Miller needed. He climbed through the fence, Rodriguez right behind him. The construction site was eerily still. Half-built structures cast jagged shadows. Loose gravel crunched beneath their boots as they scanned the area. Then the dog ran to a pile of debris, concrete chunks, broken wood and scraps of metal, and began digging frantically. Miller and Rodriguez raised their flashlights and froze. A small, unmoving hand was barely visible beneath the rubble. "Dear God," Miller whispered. Both officers rushed forward, adrenaline surging through their veins. They weren't chasing a stray dog. They were following a hero. Miller and Rodriguez dropped to their knees, throwing aside broken slabs of concrete and twisted metal with shaking hands. The dog whined and scratched at the debris, desperate to reach what lay beneath. Then Miller uncovered a small, fragile body, a little girl, motionless, covered in dirt, her skin cold to the touch. Bruises marred her tiny arms, her dress torn and caked in dust. Her lips were cracked, her breath barely there. Rodriguez's heart pounded as he pressed 2 fingers against her neck. A long, agonizing second passed. Then, faint but present, a pulse. "She's alive," he gasped, already reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, we need an ambulance now. Child found unconscious at the abandoned construction site. Severe dehydration, possible injuries. Send backup." As Rodriguez barked orders, Miller couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene. The dog had laid down beside the girl, pressing its nose against her cheek and letting out a low, mournful whimper. It was as if it had been guarding her this whole time, refusing to leave until help arrived. Then something caught Miller's attention. Just beyond the rubble, faint tire tracks were imprinted in the dirt, leading away from the scene. His stomach twisted. This wasn't an accident. This girl wasn't just lost. She had been left here, and whoever had done it had tried to make sure she wouldn't be found. Rodriguez noticed it too, his voice tight. Miller, someone dumped her here. A chilling realization crept over them both. If it hadn't been for the dog, this child would have been another tragic, unsolved case. The dog let out a sudden, low growl, its eyes locked on something beyond the shadows. Miller followed its gaze, his breath catching in his throat. A dark figure stood at the edge of the construction site, watching them, and then, in an instant, it turned and disappeared into the night. Rodriguez's radio crackled. "Ambulance is en route. ETA 3 minutes." Miller nodded, his pulse racing. The little girl barely stirred, her chest rising and falling in weak, shallow breaths. There was no time to waste. He scooped her up gently, feeling the frail weight of her in his arms. The dog barked, pacing anxiously, as if urging them to hurry. Miller sprinted toward the patrol car. "Let's go! We'll meet the ambulance halfway." Rodriguez threw open the passenger door, while Miller carefully laid the girl across the back seat. The dog tried to jump in after her. "No, boy, you can't." But the dog wouldn't back down, its brown eyes filled with determination. Rodriguez sighed and gave in. "Fine, but stay calm." The moment the car sped off, the dog nestled beside the girl, gently licking her fingers as if trying to wake her. Miller gripped the wheel, jaw tight. His mind reeled. Who could do this to an innocent child? The tire tracks, the bruises, the shadowy figure lurking nearby. This wasn't a random act. This was deliberate. Rodriguez scanned the road ahead. "We need to figure out who she is." Miller exhaled sharply. Her parents are probably out of their minds searching for her. They rounded a corner and saw flashing red and blue lights ahead. The ambulance had arrived. Screeching to a halt, Miller jumped out, cradling the girl as paramedics rushed forward. "Severe dehydration, possible trauma," he said, his voice edged with urgency. The paramedics placed her on a stretcher, checking her vitals. "She's in bad shape, but she's holding on," one of them confirmed. The dog whined, trying to follow as they loaded her into the ambulance. Rodriguez placed a hand on Miller's shoulder. "We need to get back to that site. Whoever left her there, they were watching us." Miller's jaw clenched. He turned back to the construction site, his gut telling him something dark was waiting for them. And he was right, because they weren't just dealing with an abandoned child. They were about to uncover something far more sinister. Back at the construction site, the night air felt heavier. A sickening realization settled over Miller and Rodriguez. Whoever left the girl there had been watching them. Maybe they still were. Rodriguez knelt beside the tire tracks in the dirt. "These are fresh," he muttered. "Whoever did this was here recently." Miller's stomach twisted, and they could be coming back. The dog, still restless, sniffed the ground, then suddenly bolted toward a narrow service road. It stopped, looked back, and barked, a clear signal. Miller and Rodriguez exchanged a glance. "We follow him," Miller said. The road was dark and lined with abandoned buildings. The dog led them to an old warehouse, its metal doors rusted and slightly ajar. A faint light flickered inside. Rodriguez drew his gun. "This place gives me a bad feeling." Miller nodded, pushing the door open. The air inside was stale, carrying a rotten stench. As their flashlights swept the room, they found a chilling sight. A single chair in the middle of the floor, ropes dangling from its arms. Rodriguez exhaled sharply. This wasn't random. She was held here. The walls were covered with surveillance photos, dozens of them. Children's faces stared back, some of them circled in red. And in the very center was a picture of the little girl they had just saved. Miller's blood ran cold. She wasn't just lost, she was targeted. Then movement. A noise deeper inside the warehouse. The dog's ears perked up. A low growl rumbled in its throat. Miller tightened his grip on his weapon. "We're not alone." Rodriguez's radio crackled. "Dispatch, we need backup at an abandoned warehouse near the construction site. Possible suspect on the premises." The dog suddenly barked and charged into the darkness. Heavy footsteps pounded against the concrete. Someone was running. Miller and Rodriguez took off after them. Their chase had just begun. The warehouse echoed with frantic footsteps as Miller and Rodriguez sprinted after the fleeing suspect. The dog, driven by something deeper than instinct, bolted ahead, its growls sharp and menacing. "Stop, police!" Rodriguez shouted, his voice bouncing off the metal walls. The suspect didn't stop. Instead, they crashed through the back exit, disappearing into the shadows outside. Miller's heart pounded as he pushed through the door, scanning the alleyway. Then headlights flared to life. A black SUV roared to life just a few yards away, tires screeching against the pavement. "He's trying to get away!" Rodriguez yelled, raising his gun. Before they could react, the dog lunged. It leaped onto the SUV's open driver's side window, jaws snapping down on the suspect's arm. A scream tore through the air. The vehicle swerved wildly, skidding to a stop as the suspect struggled to shake the dog off. Blood splattered against the window. Miller and Rodriguez moved in. "Hands where we can see them! Now!" The suspect, face twisted in pain and panic, had no choice. They raised their trembling hands. Rodriguez yanked the car door open and hauled the suspect out. The dog, teeth still bared, stood firm, ready to strike again if needed. Miller's grip tightened on his gun as he got a good look at the man, unshaven, wild-eyed, and eerily familiar. His face matched the blurred image from the surveillance footage. Rodriguez pressed the suspect against the SUV. "We got you." Miller exhaled, his mind racing. The warehouse, the photos, the little girl, it all made sense now. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. This man was part of something bigger. The dog stood beside them, its body still tense. Miller reached down and stroked its head. "You knew, didn't you?" The dog just wagged its tail, but its eyes stayed locked on the man who had hurt that little girl. Sirens wailed in the distance. Backup was coming. But tonight the real hero wasn't wearing a badge. It had 4 legs, sharp instincts, and an unbreakable heart. The little girl lay in a hospital bed, her tiny fingers curled around a soft blanket. Though she was safe, the ordeal had left her weak and silent. Doctors said she was dehydrated, exhausted, and deeply traumatized, but she was alive, and that was a miracle. By her side, refusing to leave, was the stray dog, the hero who had saved her life. The nurses tried to usher the dog out, but every time they did, the girl's eyes would well up with tears. So they let him stay, curled up beside her, his warm body pressed protectively against hers. Word of the rescue spread quickly. News channels called it the stray dog that solved a crime. Officers in the precinct took turns bringing food and treats, calling him guardian. But to the little girl, he was more than just a hero. He was family. The investigation into the warehouse led to something even darker. Files, photos, and disturbing evidence linked the suspect to a network of missing children. Thanks to the officers and the dog, the police cracked the case wide open, stopping a trafficking ring in its tracks. Days later, the girl's parents arrived, their faces pale with grief and hope. When they saw their daughter alive, they collapsed into sobs, holding her so tightly, it was as if they were afraid to let go. And then, there was the dog. The girl's mother knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "We owe you everything." When it was time for the little girl to leave the hospital, the officers had one last question. What should we do with the dog? The girl answered without hesitation. She reached for his fur, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's coming home with me." And just like that, the nameless stray who had once wandered the streets alone had found his forever home. As they left the hospital together, the little girl reached down, stroking his head. "You saved me." The dog wagged his tail and leaned into her touch. He didn't need words to say what he already knew. He had found his purpose, and he had finally found love. If you enjoy this story, like, share, subscribe, and comment. Where are you watching from?